Good
Hello,
evening
hello, hello.
and welcome everyone. How you doing, brother?
Man, I'm good, man. I'm good. Busy is crazy busy over here. But good, man. Good to see you, my brother, in the building again. CJC Conscious and Justice Council. One more time.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we have a great show today. We're very happy to have some outstanding guests who are going to share
Yes.
with us exactly what they think about this new interpretation of the IRS
Mm,
as regards to endorsing candidates. And we're just really
mhm.
pleased to have the caliber of people once again joining us here on our Conscience and Justice Council today. Should churches endorse political candidates? Should churches endorse political candidates? And we're going to invite you to tell your friends, your family, and your foes to come and join us and to engage in this wonderful discussion. We have four all-star guests that we have that will be participating
Yes.
with us today. And there's none other than our first guest is the Parle Director and General Counsel from the Lake Union Conference, Harvard educated herself, none other than the distinguished Jennifer Gray Woods. Welcome to the broadcast.
Thank you. Good evening.
Good
And it's
evening.
always nice to have a chief consultant. You know, we don't want a little consultant, a minor consultant. We need a chief consultant from the California State Assembly, a religious liberty advocate in her own right. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome the legendary Janice Warden Washington. And
Wonderful to be here.
thank you. And then,
Glad
as
to have
always,
you. Glad to
we
have
have a good doctor in the house who's a lawyer as well as a church historian himself, and it's none other than Dr. Nicholas Miller. He does make house calls, and we're happy that he is here with us.
Thank you, Woody.
And last but not least, we have a true champion from the streets of Philadelphia. Some of you might say he flies like an eagle and punches like Rocky Balboa, but we have another
you.
Juris
Mercy.
Doctor, PhD in the house, who's the visiting professor of philosophy at Whitman College. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Timothy J. Golden. Welcome to the broadcast. All right, let's get right at it. Jennifer Gray Woods, first question goes to you. Tell us a little bit about this. Should churches endorse political candidates? Really starts off with the Johnson Amendment. So if you can kind of explain the Johnson Amendment and then the interpretation of the IRS, which brings us to the show today, that would be great to give us some background. And if any of our panelists want to chime in after Jennifer's comments, so please feel free to do so. Jennifer.
Sure. And I'll get us started with what it is, and then I'm going to let Tim talk about kind of the changes that have happened. And I think before we get started, we should talk about the Internal Revenue Code, because this is really what this is all about, right? And when we refer to certain tax exempt organizations like charities and churches, oftentimes we call them 501c3s because they've applied for status as a charitable organization under Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code. Now, churches don't have to apply, they get status automatically, but they can apply as well. And I bring this up because there are other types of tax exempt organizations besides 501c3s. For example, there are 501c6s that encompass like business leagues or a chamber of commerce. And all of these 501cs, they get tax exempt status. But with 501c3s, the thing that makes them unique is that when people donate to these types of organizations, those donations are also tax deductible. So they have this special status. But because of this, they have some requirements and restrictions as far as who and what can qualify as a tax exempt organization under 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code. So to get this 501c3 status, an organization has to be organized and operated exclusively for exempt purposes. And none of its earnings can go to any private shareholder or individual. And the last part is that these organizations can't attempt to influence legislation as a substantial part of their activities and can't participate in campaigning activities for or against candidates. And this last part is what we refer to as the Johnson Amendment. This was a provision that was added to the tax code in 1954, I believe. And again, it prohibits these 501c3 organizations in particular from endorsing or opposing political candidates. These restrictions don't apply to the other 501c organizations, but there's a rationale for that because these organizations don't receive tax deductible donations from people that want to donate to these organizations, but 501c3s do. And so since 1954 until today, this has been the case. Over the years, there have been attempts by some organizations to try to revoke this Johnson Amendment. In 2017, there were a lot of efforts in legislation and through executive order and through some groups that tried to encourage churches, for example, to explicitly endorse candidates, right? Trying to push this issue of the constitutionality of the Johnson Amendment, whether or not it violates the First Amendment, for example. But very recently, just a couple of weeks ago, there has now been a change to the interpretation by the IRS as far as how the Johnson Amendment applies to churches and religious organizations. And I'm going to go on and let Tim talk about that change.
Tim's on mute.
No, I'm not. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
You can't hear me. Okay. All right. My apologies. So, as Jennifer said, just a few weeks ago, the National Religious Broadcasters, it's an organization along with two Texas churches, filed an action against the IRS in which they were arguing that the Johnson Amendment should not prohibit churches from endorsing political candidates. And as of, I think it was July 14th, the IRS entered into a consent decree allowing that to happen. Now, I think the question that this raises for churches is the difference between can and should, right? Just because you can do something, does that mean that you should do something? And if we just start with some very basic differences between what's legal and what's moral, there are lots of things that are lawful for us to do that we don't do, right? To start with our denomination, tobacco is legal, but, we condemn smoking, alcohol is lawful. And I think in this case, the issue, while not one of personal behavior, but one of corporate behavior as a church, I think has to take into account that churches have a different set of values, right, than politicians. Churches have deep moral commitments, they have deep spiritual commitments. And I think the question before we engage in any such endorsing of political candidates is not can we do it, but ought we do it, right? Is it something that we should do? Because I would think that we don't want churches to deteriorate into political parties that are governed by the secular calculus of what is expedient. As Christians, at least, I think we ought to always be concerned with the question of what is right. And politicians move on a different moral plane than the church. And so the consent decree is there. We are poised to enter an era of change in terms of what churches can do. But I think the question for churches, because of our different value systems or any religious organization, is not can we do it, but should we do it? And to me, because our value systems are so radically different, at least theoretically, from secular politics, to that question should be a hard no, that we shouldn't do that. But again, it looks like at least the IRS for now is trying to carve out this exception, saying that you can do it. So that's my assessment of the situation.
And you know what I find interesting as well is that so much of this from the two churches and the two very conservative groups that brought the lawsuit, they also in part were basing it off of the fact that they find it to be an infringement of the First Amendment right. And I think that that's quite interesting because I know that once this ruling came out earlier this month, the Freedom from Religion Foundation, and that's a group of over 40,000, ironically, atheists, agnostics, and skeptics of any pedigree, that they were stunned by the reversal of this decades-long policy that has been since the amendment of 1954. And it's interesting because this same foundation has brought several different lawsuits throughout the years when people have quote unquote violated the prior prohibition, including the Billy Graham Association. They recently in 2024 filed a lawsuit for that as well. And so it's quite interesting that we have people who aren't even considered faith-based who don't feel that this should have happened. And yet I've encountered many faith-based individuals saying, oh, this is great. We can finally say what we want to say. But I would contend it very well leads down to a slippery slope of a bully pulpit, if you will.
Mm.
John, I think, been very enlightening about the history of all of this. And I think the history is very important. And a couple of things emerge. What Timothy says, not all things that are legal are ideal or even moral. And yet I back a little bit that every reference to elected leaders by religious leaders might cross the morality or immorality, right? I think we have biblical precedents that suggest that, in fact, truth to power, which can involve religious leaders. And I agree with me on that point. But to go back to the history that Jennifer so aptly laid out, I hope it's clear that this just isn't about, some people have bemoaned the loss of the separation of church and state, that somehow this was meant to keep religion and politics apart. But Jennifer's well-studied history demonstrates this was much broader than that. This was about 501c3s generally. And in fact, the original organizations that were involved were not organizations. It was Johnson in a Senate fight in Texas, and then one of his opponents brought a couple of right-wing 501c3s to the table, foundations, but they weren't religious at all. And it applied to this whole profits that can get deductible donation, and the religious ones were just kind of caught up in that. And it's interesting to me. We have a number of individuals here who are very much from within the Black church tradition, which has a very proud heritage of speaking to issues of public policy and leadership issues in our country in ways that the white side of the church has forgotten how to do. And I guess I'm just wondering if, the Johnson Amendment wasn't required by the clause of the Constitution, right? I mean, this wasn't the result of some Supreme Court interpretation. This was, again, a general net that said all 501c3 stay out. And largely supportive of what Timothy is saying about the lack of wisdom in having church leaders and pastors support or oppose partisan political candidates, because you're going to risk the patient, right? There's no doubt about that. But my question is, should the government be telling religious leaders and pastors what to say or not to say in the pulpit on Sunday or Sabbath morning, which is what the Johnson Amendment did? And I really question whether it didn't violate the Free Exercise Clause and the Free Speech Clause, even if there are other very not do it. And I'd be interested to see how Timothy and Jennifer and some of the others react to that assertion. And again, Timothy, you seem to be on mute or something. We've suddenly lost.
Is that better?
There we go.
Right here.
Okay. All right. So thanks, Nick. I think that's a good question. So I think embedded within Nick Miller's question is some nuance that we might be missing in the conversation, right? Because there are at least two dispositions of churches toward politics that I think need to be distinguished from one another. One of those dispositions is what I would call a Constantinian disposition toward politics that seeks to garner political power at the expense of the gospel, right? Hence, you could tell by the name of it, right? This is Emperor Constantine. This is his highly questionable, if not altogether bogus, conversion to Christianity and his subsequent appropriation of the Christian gospel to his political ends rather than to the ends of Jesus Christ. And I think what we have seen here in the United States historically with mainline evangelical Christianity has been this Constantinian disposition, a disposition that is so little concerned with the gospel and so much concerned with political power that about 20 years ago, the person who President George W. Bush tapped to come to Washington to be the head of faith-based initiatives in his cabinet ended up leaving, saying these people in Washington don't care about religion at all, right? These people only care about political power. So that's one disposition of Christianity toward politics. Another one is the prophetic disposition toward politics. And here is where you get a lot of the Black church standing over against political powers, condemning their participation in, I don't know, for example, Jim Crow, right? Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. There's an entire tradition of Black natural law in the United States, in African American social and political thought. Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, the Advent founders, right? Many of them had a prophetic disposition toward politics because of their condemnation of chattel slavery, etc. So I think we have to be careful and ask ourselves which one of these two dispositions was the Johnson Amendment intended to curtail? And I think you would have to admit that it would be the Constantinian disposition, right? This idea that if churches are supposed to, and religious organizations are supposed to be about what's moral, then we can't have them, or we don't want them involved in corrupting their own agendas, right? I mean, if that's what really matters to you, do you need to be more like Constantine, or do you need to be more like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, etc.? So I think once we clarify those two dispositions in Christianity toward politics, I think we can get a clearer picture of perhaps what the Johnson Amendment, in part at least, was trying to do.
Well, but it was the amendment specifically didn't target religious groups of one kind or another. It just said all 501c3s. So, if you want to make a new sort of amendment that will capture and keep out Constantinian religion and keep in, call it Martin Luther King Jr. religion, then we could try to write such an amendment. But the Johnson Amendment wasn't intended to do that. And I guess the follow-up question would be, can you really create a rule that will keep one out and the other one in? I like the politics that Martin Luther King Jr. has, but that Jerry Falwell has. What's the principle?
Again, I don't know. So I'll just say this. I don't know how we craft a law or a public policy that accomplishes that. But what I will say is that if we're really Christians trying to do the right thing, we don't need a law or public policy to guide us. We
Bingo.
should be guided by what we know to be true in terms of the Christian gospel. Uh,
Absolutely.
so that would, I think that would be my reply to that.
Yeah.
Well, and I think what's also significant, and I agree with what has been stated, what's also significant, or what I find to be significant, is that my understanding is with the agreement or the ruling that has come down, it's the first time that I'm aware of that the IRS actually publicly made an agreement to the language in the consent decree. And that is something that they've not really done in the past. Arguably, they've not necessarily enforced certain things against houses of worship for speech, concerning electoral processes, or how some ministers from the pulpit and others will bring a candidate up and let them speak, and all of those different things. But now I truly believe that religious organizations, 501c3 religious organizations, will need to consider the scenarios of how they communicate, or endorse candidates, and if they're urging their congregations to vote accordingly. The thing that I also find interesting is that with all of this, it almost seems like it's yet again a win for Christian nationalists who are saying, hurrah, hurrah, we get what we want, and we can continue to proceed as is. And I think that's something we also need to be very careful and be mindful of, because the scenarios really need to be evaluated in light of the consent decree, but also being able to be mindful of, as I mentioned before, the whole bully pulpit issue, because people in positions of authority, I'm concerned that they will continue potentially to then use this opportunity not to have to be so cautious about what they say, but then to perhaps persuade their congregants as to what they think they should do. And ultimately, again, it could be a very dangerous path that we're encountering, whether it's a good endeavor or not. That's still a slippery slope. Like, we really are supposed to be free will thinkers.
No, I agree. And, I look back at, 2017, when there were efforts to try to repeal the Johnson Amendment altogether, right? And nonprofit organizations, they really pushed back on this because they saw it as having guardrails. They saw that, if the Johnson Amendment is done away with, that it erodes, donor trust, how it erodes the effectiveness of the mission of the nonprofit and its integrity, and even just the mission itself. And I think that as Christians, that our mission, our biblical mission, is definitely eroded if we allow campaigning to take place from the pulpit. When we allow pastors to tell congregations or encourage congregations who to vote for, who is a righteous candidate and who is not, that causes significant problems. And I know we've all probably seen the Johnson Amendment violated at some form or another within our congregations or congregations that we visited. And, we've heard stories of churches that violate it blatantly all the time. But this is just going to give people more of a boost to continue doing that. And back in 2017, what I really loved is that the Adventist Church did make a statement on this. When Congress and when the executive order, all these things were contemplating repealing the Johnson Amendment, the church had a position statement that it issued, or a statement that it issued on April the 6th. And it said, because of the biblical beliefs and practices, the Seventh-day Adventist Church does not desire to intervene in elections. Additionally, the church has opposed certain previous proposals for a full repeal of the Johnson Amendment. Therefore, while recognizing the law's potential First Amendment concerns, as I think we just talked about a little bit, the church reaffirms its opposition to legislative efforts to eliminate or weaken rules that prohibit nonprofits, including houses of worship, from endorsing or opposing candidates. And it went on to say that if the law were to be changed, the church will not modify its practice of remaining neutral in elections. While church members are free to support candidates or even run for office themselves, it is not the role of the church to become involved in the electoral sphere. And I really appreciate that our church took that position then. I hope that we reissue something now that this reinterpretation of the Johnson Amendment has taken place. But I think we need to be very mindful, going back to what Tim said, just because it's legal, it does not mean that it is moral or a space that we should be entering into as a church.
I
So
agree.
Go ahead, Jeannie's.
Oh, I was just saying, I agree with that. And what Jennifer was saying even reminds me of some quotes that Ellen White talked about, from a long time ago, Counsels for the Church. And this is a direct quote: "Those who teach the Bible in our churches and our schools are not at liberty to unite in making apparent their prejudices for or against political men or measures, because by so doing, they stir up the minds of others, leading each to advocate his favorite theory. There are among those professing to believe present truth some who will thus be stirred up to express their sentiments and political preferences, so that division will be brought into the church. We cannot with safety take part in any political schemes." And then she also says in the Fundamentals of Christian Education that we cannot labor to please men who will use their influence to repress religious liberty and to set in operation oppressive measures that lead or compel their fellow men to keep Sunday as the Sabbath. And so it can be challenging. And I am glad that in 2017, the church was vocal, because I'll say it, I'm a layperson. I'm concerned that oftentimes we don't speak up and advocate and take an actual stand. And whether everyone agrees with that stand or not, that's an individual thing. But as a worldwide church, and we just had the General Conference, we really truly need to be more about making a statement and people being at least aware that there is a belief within the corporate or the corporate body, the worldwide church. So I agree. I really do hope that we hear something, because right now, not hearing anything, we're seeing a lot of ongoing division that happens.
So
go ahead, Nick.
Oh no, if you want to move things along, that's fine.
No. I was going to do a follow-up question to Janice. Go ahead.
No, do it then.
Okay, Janice, you mentioned measures in the council. Quote, now, would that include ballot proposals? Would that just be limited to just candidates?
So my understanding, and with my understanding of this particular statement and other statements that I've researched that Ellen White has talked about voting and everything like that, and endorsing candidates, she was very specific. I don't have it committed to memory with where exactly, but she was specific that as Seventh-day Adventist Christians, we should be voting, especially when it comes down to issues, ballot measures that have the ability to affect negative or would have negative consequences on us, especially when there's so many moving pieces and people, including back in the day, the movement of being, not having tobacco, not having alcohol. Those were ballot provisions. And she said, we need to vote on these things, these health principles. And if we look at today's situation from what she spoke about, the core of that is we always, in all of our different states, have so many propositions on our ballots that could have negative consequences that require people to pay attention. I personally do not believe that anything should be endorsed from the pulpit. I do believe that there should be an opportunity for members to be aware of what a yes vote means versus a no vote. But I don't think it's appropriate for someone to then say you should vote yes on Prop 1, 2, and vote no on Proposition 12B. I don't think that that's appropriate, but I do believe that there should be an opportunity for members to come together and understand that if they choose to vote yes, the consequences are this, and if they choose to vote no, the consequences are that.
Unfortunately, like the Johnson Amendment, like churches and other 501c3s are not prohibited from doing that activity of voter education. So,
right. Exactly.
That lines up. That's fine.
Okay, Nick, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to put my lawyer hat on and I don't think we've clarified what this ruling actually does, right? It doesn't do away with the amendment. It doesn't an amendment as to churches. What it does is it protects pastors in the usual communication to their parishioners to share with them their biblically informed perspectives on public policy issues, including electoral, right? So there's some qualifiers there that make it narrow. It doesn't allow pastors to buy bulletin boards on freeways and say vote for candidate X. It has to be in the context of
They might help.
to the church in typical avenues that the church has used in the past, right? There's strictures on this that people should be aware of. But my church historians had on for a moment, and wonder if you would be surprised that in certain circumstances appear to have endorsed certain candidates and told church members to vote for them. This occurred in Michigan. And there were not just on the ballot, but candidates running for office that were going to support the temperance movement, that were going to vote against alcohol, say in Battle Creek. And the forces that were in opposition to temperance reform rigged the laws so that the elections would take place on Saturday and Saturday only, because they hoped that the Seventh-day Adventists would stay home. According to her son, Willie White, she got up in the pulpit and told the Adventists that they had a duty to, even if it was on Sabbath, to support the candidates for temperance. Now, it was clear who the candidates for temperance were and who the candidates for temperance weren't, right? So in effect, she got up in the pulpit and endorsed a certain group of candidates. Now, it was based on an issue, I agree, and it was during the Civil War that James White reported that in the election of 1860, that Adventists to a man, and he would have said to a person, voted for Abraham Lincoln because of the issue of slavery. So it was interesting that while they may not have gone out and said you should vote for candidate X, they did go out and say you need to vote for a candidate that A, opposes slavery, or B, opposes the use of alcohol and is in favor of temperance reform. So I'm generally in agreement. Nonpartisan is always good. Not choosing candidates is always good. But we have to look at the history of our church and see that at times there was a willingness to step out and put the influence of the leaders on one side of obviously moral issues that related to deeply both moral and spiritual truths that the church stood for. And I think we have to take that into account.
And Nick, I think you raise a good point there, because I think that sometimes our churches go the other way as well, where we stay silent on everything. And we sometimes use pieces of Ellen White guidance or pieces of church history to justify that, to say, well, that's political and we should not enter into that space. But if you're holistic in reading Ellen White's writings, if you take a holistic view of church history, it's clear that we were not apolitical, right? Our church founders, there were causes that they viewed as biblical, just, righteous causes that they were willing to engage in, and even on the Sabbath, right? And so our church has to have wisdom and Holy Spirit guidance as far as how we engage in the issues of the day where biblical justice is involved, and yet at the same time refrain from becoming political in the sense of endorsing political parties, endorsing certain individuals, aligning ourselves with certain parties, which is, there are many problems with that. But one of them is it's very alienating, right? Because we have members within our church who fall across the whole political spectrum. And the moment that a pastor gets up on the pulpit and starts endorsing one candidate or one party and demonizing another, they are effectively making themselves they're making themselves they're unable to reach that other half that have already aligned with the other party, right? And so again, it goes to mission effectiveness. As a church, if our mission is to reach all people, then there's certain lines we have to be willing to say we're not going to cross this, but at the same time, we have to be relevant to meeting the issues and needs of society, especially when it comes to biblical justice issues.
Well said, Jennifer.
Tim, trying to say something, but again, on mute. Tim, you got to check your mute status. No. Oh.
We can't hear you.
Oh no, that was Edward.
Can you hear me now?
Now
we can hear you now.
Okay. Something is wrong with my microphone. I have to get that fixed. But I agree with everything that Nick and Jennifer said. I do think, however, that also, I'm not a church historian of Nick Miller's caliber, but I will say that the church has a history of being selective in its political engagements, right? What Ellen White did in the 19th century, that something happened, and the post World War II SDA church became completely opposed to political involvement in protest marches of the sort that brought about the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which ended Jim Crow, for example. And the irony of Adventists opposing that law and opposing political involvement is that we are some of the biggest beneficiaries of it on the backside because of Title VII, which protects religious freedom in the workplace, right? So every time someone needs a Sabbath accommodation at work, they are invoking a law that resulted from protest movements to which the church was opposed. And it was the African American church who largely decided to go against the grain of that kind of policy from the General Conference and get involved in those protest movements anyway. So I think, in some sense, the church has always been political. The question is, what kind of politics do we engage? Do we only engage the politics that benefits us at a given historical moment? Or are we going to operate with integrity and say, and say that right is right and wrong is wrong, right? And if we see something wrong, like Jim Crow, for example, we're not going to discourage our members or our pastors from coming and speaking out against that, right? We're going to allow that. I love it when I hear people say things like the church should not be political. And in some sense, I know that they mean maybe we shouldn't be endorsing political candidates. But you say that, and then you ask in the next breath for a Sabbath accommodation letter, right? which is thoroughly political, right? It's you're engaged in the political process. You're invoking legal protection, and so I think we have to be careful because we know what our motives are. I think what Nick described, Ellen White doing, is I think it's the kind of thing that has to be the exception, right? Not the rule. And I think we have too easily turned the exception into the rule. And I think that's where we get in trouble.
Edward, you're muted.
Muted.
Christian, you had a couple of questions. Go ahead.
I did have a couple of questions. Can you guys hear me fine?
Mhm.
Yeah.
I hear you.
Okay. My internet's been giving me a hard time over here. So I had a question that I had dropped in the chat, wondering, the slippery slope has already taken place. I like Dr. Miller's explanation of what hasn't happened as yet, but it's slippery. And I'm just wondering, based on how vindictive the current federal government can be, what's the smartest way for us to handle dissent as a church? I know the statement, Jennifer read that statement, what the church has said, and it's clear what we believe. But should we be defiant as an institution and risk being the subject of, I don't know, some kind of retaliatory whatever, or should it be grassroots? Should we be just kind of get our people together on how to move forward? What you guys are the smart ones in the room. What would you say is the best way? Because I believe in speaking truth to power. I believe in being prophetic. As Tim has said, what's the most effective way for us to make a difference right now?
Well, I can jump in on that. Because the consent decree is limited, as we've heard, it's limited in scope. It's not a license for religious organizations to begin functioning as campaign operations, like point blank. That we can't start down that path. I saw a comment that popped up from one of the viewers saying that in some situations they feel that the church is undercover MAGA. Everyone is entitled to their opinions, and I've encountered several who profess to be Seventh-day Adventist Christians who are 100% Christian nationalists. So we've already encountered, as we've said, people have a whole variety of mind, thoughts, and beliefs. But given the novelty and the specificity of the IRS's position of churches and synagogues and other religious organizations, I truly believe that before a pastor or someone of that authority and head elder or something just starts deciding to use the pulpit to do this, that they really should get counsel before breaching that wall that Johnson Amendment has, attempted to erect.
Well, I was just going to an Ellen White quote that you shared with us is almost word like parts of the Johnson Amendment. I mean, in some ways, Ellen White saw that spiritual principles called for something like the Johnson Amendment.
Mm-hmm.
Probably why we as a church haven't pushed back it. I think the Johnson Amendment in its application to churches and ministers and pulpits is flatly unconstitutional. I think ministers should be able to speak to whatever issue of the day they want to, even if it's unwise. They should be disciplined by their churches. They shouldn't be disciplined by the government. So, yes, First Amendment, but inside the church, our church policy, Ellen White's counsel may not be binding and authoritative in some, inner church, but I think we view it as a deep heavenly wisdom that we should apply, with the occasional exception, that Timothy and I talked about, where there is such apparent evil. Like, sometimes history can be a good way to think about these problems. Do we haven't church in Germany had said something against Adolf Hitler? Are we embarrassed that not only did we not say anything, we actually said positive things about him and we upheld him as a model to our people? As far as I'm concerned, as a historian, that is a disgrace. It is a blot on our history.
Mm-hmm.
And that if we ever encounter circumstances, we should do the opposite, right? And yet, there's not that many Hitlers in history. We can't make every politician into a Hitler and say we have to. But I think there needs to be thoughtful, intelligent, meaningful internal conversation that doesn't proceed from the point we can never publicly criticize a civil leader as a church. Or who wouldn't make John the Baptist, who criticized Herod, or Jesus Christ himself, who called Herod that fox, right? And they didn't have electoral politics. In some ways, this was even worse. This could have been considered seditious libel. And in fact, John paid head. So there are times when the church, in its internal discourse, needs to decide if something has gone beyond the moral pale that calls for a response. And if it has, then our prophetic voice needs to be heard, whether the government has outlawed it or not.
And I think that if it comes to that point, then yeah, our church should speak, and we speak knowing that we may lose the 501c3 status, right? Like, that's the consequence there, right? Because the government is giving something. And when the government gives something, there are always some sort of strings attached in that process, right? So we are getting the ability to get tax-free donations or tax-deductible donations. And in return, we abide by the Johnson Amendment, right? Regardless of the morality of it, regardless of the fact that we already have guardrails as a church. But if we got to the point where there is another Hitler, right? I would hope our church is willing to say that we value speaking truth more than the financial benefits. But that's really what we're talking about here.
Mm-hmm.
Is churches are free to say whatever they want to say, but if you're going to be under the 501c3 status, then there are these conditions that come with that.
Well, and that's happening now to places like Harvard and Columbia, and are we going to? So we shouldn't be surprised if it comes to us soon too.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Interesting you said that, Jennifer, because that's also the reason why we have integrated schools, is because they threaten to take away our tax exempt status you remember in 1965 when
Mm-hmm.
Randy Stafford and with the Meridian School, and they came and they were joined in the lawsuit. Actually, the South Central Conference sued the Mississippi Alabama Conference, which is now the Gulf State Conference. And this is when Pastor Dudley was the president of South Central, and there was a Nicholas Katzenbach who was the attorney general at the time, and they instructed the church not only did they have to integrate the Meridian School, but all their schools, and if not, they would lose their tax exempt status. And you can
Mm-hmm.
see that story in the Seventh Day Adventists and the Civil Rights Movement by Samuel London. Bits of that story is in Progress and Protest and Progress by Dr. Calvin B. Rock.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result of that, the church did not want to lose the incentive and did the right thing. And Elder Dudley is often quoted as saying, it wasn't a movement of God, but a movement of money that caused the church to do the right thing as it relates to that. So you kind of see a double-edged sword when the church shouldn't be moved by money, as you said earlier, but here in the case, the church was moved by money to do the right thing.
So can I ask a follow up question? So as a church administrator, so you know that our tax exempt status, the as, at least in the North American division, they like us to come through one 501c3 number. Is that correct? Okay. Wouldn't it? I'm just talking strategy. If that's going to be the pushback, so we can do our work and be prophetic, wouldn't it make sense? I'm gonna try to say this right without getting in trouble. To begin thinking about decentralizing our structure so that I can speak truth to power here in Kansas City, and Tim and Nick and Janice and Jennifer and Woody can do the same wherever we are, still be connected as a. So I'm not talking about breaking up the denomination. I'm just saying it would be difficult to cut the head off the snake if there are many heads. So I don't know. I'm just saying what I know is a lot of times we have our own attorneys that try to keep us from being the ire of the, you know, we got all of these rules and regulations, and and employers, employees, we have all of these things that we go through so that we don't get dinged, and I'm wading into a whole lot of stuff right now, so I'm gonna stop talking. But I'm just throwing that out as, if we need to take these stands, I don't want to be prevented from doing what my prophetic call is in speaking this truth to power. I don't know, just something for us to think about as we see the slippery slope happening.
I don't have an answer to that. I see where you're going though. I think of so many different organizations and businesses, and granted, while we don't always like to say that the church is a business, we definitely know there's the business arm of our church, right? And the structure there, and we know there are politics within the church, all of that.
Yep.
But what some businesses and organizations do, they will have the head, if you will, and then they create a foundation and let the foundation be the nonprofit arm of it, so that they're working in concert, but they can separate things as they need to, even though they're technically one entity, but technically two. So I see where you're going with that. I don't know if that works with our worldwide structure that we have, because we're very much, organizationally structured, but that is something that I believe, those that are employed by our church and the lay people like myself, that we might want to think about, what does that look like? What would that structure entail? And would that be something that allows for maybe a way to have ongoing transparency, ongoing thought processes, and yet not putting in jeopardy certain things that so many hold so dear? Because I'm with Jennifer. If we get to a point where we want to stand our ground, or as Dr. Miller mentioned, it's heinous when I think back to what the church said during Hitler's time and applauding him because he was plant-based. Like, what? Like, and yet we were the church. Woo, yay, we love this man. Like, what? So if it gets to that point, I agree with Jennifer. Like, it might be challenging. They might see a decrease in tithe and offering returns. But if that's what it takes to make sure that we're able to clean cut with the head completely severed and still advocate for what we know God is telling us, then maybe that's what we do. But maybe in the meantime, we look at a slight reorg where you can have this, subsidiary that's still connected as a foundation or something. I don't know, but I see where you're going.
See where we go. Okay. And that was not one of my questions, but okay. Anybody else wants to weigh in?
Well, I don't know, Jennifer. You've worked with General, or I know that each conference is typically its own corporation. It has a corporate entity status. That's the lowest level of church organization, and then union level, you'll have a corporate status, and then again at the division. I suspect we hold our not-for-profit at the division level, at least in the North American division. I don't know, Jennifer. Do you know more about that? You worked in
the group exemption is at the GC level.
At the GC level, but wouldn't it be?
Yeah.
States, right? I mean, in other words, there's no such thing that I'm aware of like worldwide not-for-profit status.
No, but it's because the GC is based in the United States, right? So it has. So, I mean, that's a whole other conversation as far as church structure and the layers of the conference associations versus conference and division, and so I am not going into that one at this point. But I hear what you're saying, Elder Josiah.
Yeah.
Well, if I can just chime in here, I think
Tim, you're a little low.
We can hear you a little low.
You can hear me, but I'm low.
There we go.
Now you're better.
Is that better?
Yes.
That's better.
Okay.
That's
all
good.
right.
Oh yeah.
So I think what Jennifer said earlier when she was reading from the church's statement in 2017, I think there are times, right, when there is a benefit to our church structure in that we have a general conference that's going to come out and make certain policy statements on certain issues. So I think that's good. But I also think that one of the major organizational dysfunctions of the Seventh-day Adventist Church is that local churches almost routinely feel themselves disempowered because of our top-down model, right, of organization. In other words, a lot of people at local churches are situated in communities that need a prophetic influence, right? Whether it be local issues of criminal justice, local judicial elections, etc. And yet we are waiting, local churches are waiting for word from the General Conference on what to do, right? And I think your question, you talked about being strategic. One of the best ways to be effective with our voice is for local churches to actually integrate themselves into their own communities. Every person on the local church board, in particular, and I'm speaking out of the Black church tradition, thinking of churches I've spoken at in Philadelphia and in Compton, California, etc. Every person on the local church board should be plugged into some community group or some community organization, right? Because when the time comes to speak out, if we don't have a habit of speaking out, except just when it concerns some issue of Adventist doctrine, right, then we're not going to have a lot of credibility. I mean, I think if you are the family life coordinator at a local church, you ought to have some connection to the local employment organization, right? Or have something that has to do with families, a local domestic violence shelter, right? We tend not to be too competent at ministry at the local church level, I think, because as good as it is to have an organization make a statement of the sort that Jennifer read from 2017, we also need to empower ourselves and operate with integrity, right? Not getting involved with organizations trying to turn their members into Adventists, right? But getting involved with local organizations because some of them are already doing the work and we are just there to help, right? What can we do to help? So I think if we function with integrity, then when something does happen that requires our voice, we have a lot more credibility on those issues than we would if we behaved otherwise.
I want to respond to something you said there, Tim, and that is that people are waiting for the GC or the North American Division to issue statements to empower them to act. And the truth of the matter is the GC is not going to issue statements on every single issue, right? It's a world, it's the world headquarters. It's not just speaking for the North American Division. And the same with the North American Division. They're not going to issue statements on everything. And that's not a good or bad, it's just a reality of what it is. But that does not mean that our local churches cannot and should not be active in their communities. And that's, in fact, part of what the PARL ministry is, the Public Affairs Religious Liberty ministry. And both from the GC level and from the North American Division, there's a lot of encouragement that members should be engaged with their communities, should be known by their communities, right? That they should be involved with their communities and and actually show that we care for our communities, because we would want people to miss us if we weren't in our communities. And for so many of our churches, I don't think that that's the case, but I think I find it troubling that people are waiting, or that there's a perception that people are waiting from the conference or the union or the division or the GC before they act. Churches are empowered to act. They're empowered to be involved in their communities. They're empowered to speak to the issues of the day. Just because there's not an official statement from the church, it does not mean that our local churches are supposed to be silent on those issues. We're not supposed to go, against what the statements are. If there's a statement, our churches shouldn't be going against the statement, but if there's silence, it doesn't mean that our churches have to stay silent as well. If there's a biblical basis for the statement that's going to be made, or for the activity that's going to be entered into. So.
Oh, that's right. I agree with that, Jennifer. I agree wholeheartedly. I think there's a difference between what the top organizational levels of the church intend and how the top organizational levels of the church are perceived.
Right.
I think sometimes it's a problem of perception in local churches. I've actually had some people with local years I've had people served on church boards with people who said, well, we shouldn't do anything until we hear from the GC. And I'm thinking to myself, well, why in the world would you, I don't think that's what the GC intends.
No.
Right. So I think maybe we need to have some internal conversations, right? Like this one, so that the perception changes at the local church level. Now, every local church does not feel this way, but I can speak to some of the churches that I've experienced in my time as an Adventist, and I can say that sentiment has been there, or that feeling has been there. And again, it's an organizational dysfunction that's not necessarily the fault of the organization, but it does have something to do with how our local churches perceive the broader church leadership is doing anything nefarious or trying to be hegemonic, but just that a lot of people in local churches have disempowered themselves and taken themselves out of their communities, when I think the reverse should be happening.
And I agree with what you're saying too, Professor, because perception, sadly, is reality for so many people, even if it's wrong. And so how do we go about creating a culture that, yes, we are very much organizational structure as a worldwide church, but how do we create that culture whereby lay people at a small Seventh-day Adventist church in a rural community, or the largest Seventh-day Adventist church in an urban community, and everything in between, that everyone can feel empowered in what God has called them to do. Because what I'm also finding when I've gone around different states and doing religious liberty seminars and sermons, that so many people, we've just as a whole become complacent. And then the minute something happens that should trigger some type of natural reaction to get involved, that's where I've also heard people saying, well, I don't know if I can say anything. I didn't hear anything from the general conference. And it's frustrating because the church is the people. We make up the church. And yet so many times I think people fail to realize that. Or I go back to 2020 with the murder of George Floyd, and I have friends that were being told by some of their church members that they were sinning because they participated in a protest, a peaceful protest at that. And I'm like, oh, mercy, we are, as mentioned earlier, we really are on so many different spectrums, and it can be challenging. But ultimately, we do need to be present, because if we're not actively involved in our communities, and then the minute something happens, to Jennifer's point, I want it to be that if something happens, we have advocates in the community who would be there to help advocate with us, or, you know, quote unquote, fight that cause that everyone needs to be all hands on deck. But we're not relevant in most situations. And that's the hard part. And I don't know what it is going to take for local churches to realize that they should have a presence in the community, to be engaged, to continue to develop relationships, because that's really what it's about. And ultimately, as you develop those relationships and cultivate them, there are ways for partnerships to happen. And it's not saying, oh my goodness, now that I'm going to some community organization, that I'm walking away from my Seventh-day Adventist beliefs. But I have encountered so many people that feel the minute they do anything that's with someone that's not Seventh-day Adventist, that there's something wrong with it. And we have to change that culture of behavior or thought as well.
We forget that in believes in the priesthood of all believers, that the general conference serves us. We don't serve the general conference, right? They're there to empower us and support us, but we're the church on the and the flip side of that, many people would be quite surprised at the number of statements that the general conference, the North American division, have made on a wide range of issues, including things like gun control, the environment, and racial issues, and immigration. And I mean, there's a whole host of issues that we believe that perspectives on, and it's worth a perusal of the General Conference Policy Statement webpage to see all of that. There's tremendous scope for action. If people want permission to act on a host of public affairs, that permission is out there, even if we don't need it, right? Sometimes it comforts. Like, I will often reference these statements if something comes up, there's a gun, there's a mass shooting. I find that as a nice to share the church's statement in to of militarized weapons. Most Adventists know the church has taken a position on that, but we have. And likewise, the environment, poverty, and racial justice. We can come from both directions and make progress.
And to just go back to Jennifer's point, I once had a fairly high-ranking church official tell me that, you know, the GC isn't going to make a statement about everything, because if it did, half of the church would be angry, right? I mean, we are a diverse church, right? And so, to Jennifer's point, we're not going to make statements about each and every, you know, major political issue. Although, as Nick pointed out, we have made statements on many of them. But you know, if you know, the Adventist Church is, I think, at least in North America, is as diverse, as socially and politically diverse as America itself. So if you are from Kansas and you attend a fairly conservative church, I suspect your position on the Second Amendment will be very different from someone who lives in Chicago, right, and goes to church there. So again, you know, I think Jennifer's point is a good one. The church isn't going to make a statement about everything because it's just impractical, right, to do so. It's just going to likely result in alienation among people. So, but again, I think it all comes back to integrity. I see a question here in the chat. from Angela King. It says, "How will we reach them if we don't mingle with them?" And I started thinking about Jesus's statement about the salt of the earth.
Mm-hmm.
The salt is no good if it stays in the salt shaker. You have to sprinkle it on the food, right? And then you have to stir in order to enhance the flavor. And I think that's the way we have to see ourselves, right? As mingling with or as being interspersed among communities so that we can actually reach people and enhance the flavor of social life at the local church level.
Absolutely, and I'm glad you brought in that quote from Angela, because that's exactly what I was thinking. And if we look at the Ministry of Healing quote, I believe it's page 143. Jesus mingled, he toiled, he met their needs. Then he said, "Come follow me." Well, the problem I find oftentimes is that we're not mingling, we're not toiling, and then we're just ready to try to knock on a door and pass out a flyer when we have some type of effort or evangelism meeting. Then we get upset when no one shows up. Well, where were you when they needed diapers, when they needed formula, when they needed food, when they needed backpacks? So we've got to get outside those four walls. People have heard me say this on, in different spaces, but it's true. We have to get outside those four walls, and we can't just consistently try to only minister to ourselves, because that's not Christ-like. It's just not. And I see another thing that I want to just bring in real quickly from Prescription for Change with Dr. J. Great conversation. My dad was a social activist, very engaged in ministry and the community, did not preach his opinion, but preached the importance of social awareness. And it's so true. And that's what it's about. I mean, people can have their own personal opinions, but if we do it in a way where we're not trying to persuade someone to believe the way I believe, but we're looking at the bigger cause of what is the need that someone has. I could meet that person's need, even if I may not agree with it personally, but there's a need. That's how we're helping to spread the message of Jesus and being his hands and feet and speaking for the voiceless and advocating for the orphans and the widows, and realizing that we have to go beyond our narrow minds sometimes and realize, to the points that we've heard, the General Conference, the NAD, the local unions and the local conferences, there's no way they can take positions publicly and make statements on every single thing. And we can't use that as an excuse as to why we're not engaging. And I find that that's what so many members do. Well, I can't do anything because I didn't hear from what the NAD said or my local union. Who cares? I mean, in all due respect, who cares? What did God tell you to do? Get out there and be about his business. And as we're looking back at this, I still don't think being about his business means then we're using the pulpit and being bullies. But there's so much going on, and sometimes that silence is just so overwhelming, and that's the problem that people are having. And we have to be able to look at that bigger picture and truly look at the mandate that God has given us.
Amen.
I really appreciate what you're saying,
Go ahead.
Denise. Absolutely. And we got to remember, sometimes the church has been on the wrong side of history when we're waiting for the church. Dr. Miller referenced what happened during Germany. We know what happened during the civil rights. Individual churches or individual people, were helping out during the civil rights movement. And we also know about what's going on with DEI. DEI is not limited to LGBTQ. There's a broader definition when it comes to DEI. And sometimes we tend to throw the baby out with the bathwater and don't even understand how DEI impacts our institutions. We have to be very, very careful about how we speak to those issues and assuming that the church is always right. DEI is a core value that doesn't go with an individual, but goes with the institution. And when I hear that, I cringe, is that if our core values could go back and forth with the individual and not an institution. But at the end of the day, we all know that we're not going to heaven holding hands. And you're going to offset my bad deeds, and I'm going to offset your bad deeds, and we're going to go together.
We're not going side by side, we stand. It's one. It's not unity in that case, because God died for each and every one of us, and we have to make that decision on our own. And I see a comment from Lisa, and I hear what she's saying. In fact, I actually preached a sermon about that not too long ago about Obadiah, and not at all by what I'm saying insinuating that as a whole we're not doing things to help people. There are people all over this globe and in all these different spaces and spheres that are truly helping those less fortunate, advocating for those that are, without a voice. But I also find that there's so many that are just sitting by idle and not doing anything. And that's where we have to be careful and know that everyone has a role to play. If they're too older and maybe their knees hurt and they need a new hip and they can't go walking and meeting people and maybe standing on the food distribution line or giving out clothes, they can pray. They can write cards. I mean, there's just a role that everyone can play in the spheres of influence that God has placed us in. And so thankfully, we know that there are people doing the work. I would contend all of us on this screen are following what God has called us to do. But there's so many more that I find are literally just sitting in the pews, only waiting to be fed and still having the nerve to complain. And that's what we cannot do.
I agree.
It sounds like you guys answered the question because it is.
Oh, you're mute.
We lost you.
Uh-oh.
I'm not hearing. Are you guys hearing, Josiah?
No, I don't know if you can hear us either.
Okay.
There you go. We hear you now.
You've come back. You've come back.
I've come back. Ooh, I've come back from the dead. Okay.
That's it.
I was saying that you guys answered the question.
Now you've dropped out again.
We lost you again.
Okay, go ahead and type in the chat. Okay, we can hear you a little bit, but just want to thank each of our guests for coming on. Thank the audience for the level of engagement. And once again, we're going back to people saying it's an individual responsibility, because if you're looking for the church to give you an out, you will be sadly mistaken when the Lord comes back. We are all prompted individually and collectively by the Holy Spirit. We have a church initiative called Pentecost 2025, where we're praying for the outcoming of the Holy Spirit to impact us individually as well as collectively. So let's not forget our individual responsibility, and let's not blame people for muzzling our mouths when it comes to humanitarian concerns and label them as politics, and not having the audacity and the courage to speak for ourselves. I mean, if we're behind and we're not speaking up, we have no one else to blame but the person in the mirror. I want to thank once again Dr. Nicholas Miller for joining us, PhD and JD from the Notre Dame University. I appreciate having him. Once again, thank Dr. Jennifer Gray Woods, MPH and JD, the proud director and general counsel for the Lake Union Conference. Happy to have her. Janice Wharton Washington, chief consultant. She's a policy expert guru in higher education and has a passion for religious liberty and social justice, as we saw tonight. We thank her. She always comes prepared and well-researched. That's why she's a chief consultant. Thank you again, Janice Wharton Washington. And last but not least, the visiting professor of philosophy, a lawyer in his own right. And, it's always, they say a professor of philosophy gets to philosophize and talk about anything and everything because of their intelligence and wit and wisdom. And we appreciate always having Dr. Timothy J. Golden in the house. And then last but not least, my brother from another mother, the co-host of CJC Today, Christian Josiah, proud director and the chief operating officer, vice president for administration for the Central States Conference. Very happy to have him, and always appreciate his balance and integrity when it comes to these issues, and knowing how to listen from both sides. He hears the lay voice as well as the pastor's voice. He's one of the few that can do it, and we just want to acknowledge and appreciate that giftedness and that objectivity, because we always do not see that in the ranks. So once again, thank you so much for listening. To our guests, you're going to be free to go. We are going to talk a little bit about our upcoming Conscience and Justice Council, and we're going to show you at this time who is going to be the speakers at this convention coming up September 25th to 28th in Huntsville, Alabama. So here's this quick. So we're going to go ahead and put up our slide so people can know exactly who is coming to this Conscious and Justice Conference. And we're very excited to have our different speakers and just want to share with that. And so everybody has an idea of who's coming so you can be supportive if you want to sign up and see who's going to be a part of this convention. We are very excited to share this with you. And coming up on the convention is John C. Yang. He is the president and executive director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice. John C. Yang is coming to present. Dr. Andrea King, she's the vice president for Black Ministries from the Southeastern Conference, is going to be speaking on Friday night. David Persons from David Persons Media in Huntsville is going to be working on a workshop about communication with graphics. He and Erica Keith are going to join forces. Sharon Henry, the vice president for programs for the Greater Miami urban area, is going to be a part of the program as well. Bishop Melvin Burton will be with us. Bishop Melvin Burton will be with us. Renee Scruggs from Idify. Dorothy Houston, a DEI expert. Bettina Krause, editor of Liberty Magazines. Roman Palomeros with the Latin League. He is the president of the Latin League, and this is the oldest, I want to be sure I'm very clear, the oldest and largest civil rights organization for Hispanics in the country. I already talked about Erica Keith. Michael Campbell's director of statistics and archives for the North American division. Dillis Brooks, who's going to be the chaplain at Loma Linda University, is going to talk about LGBTQ on college campuses. What would Jesus do? Preston Foster, professor of public policy at Oakwood University, will be there. Lisa Clark Diller, professor of political science at Southern Adventist University, will be there. Dr. Myron Edmonds from the Myron Edmonds Leadership Group will be preaching the Divine Worship Hour message. Amira Al-Haddad, who is the PARL director, Public Affairs Religious Liberty Director for the Southern Union, will be a part of it. Dr. Obery Hendricks, the author of Christians Against Christianity, he will be a part of that as well. And then Nicole Jurwick has declined to come. I should say she got scheduling conflict and is unable to come. But we will have someone replacing her. And then we'll have Ryan Burge. Ryan Burge is professor of practice at Washington University, and he is going to talk about the shift, the biggest shift from the left to the right was with the National Baptist Convention Incorporated. But the second biggest shift was with Adventists. And he is going to share those statistics with us. And then also do a workshop with pastors on how to use data for your evangelistic efforts, how to use data for your evangelistic efforts. So we definitely want you to see that information as well. For those who are interested, you can register for the convention. I'm putting the website on our different channels that where people are engaging and you can register. In addition, if you register by July 31st, you get a complimentary T-shirt and access to all the workshops and the plenary sessions from the convention. But you must do that by Thursday, July 31st. Thursday, July 31st. On Monday, August 4th, we'll be opening up the convention for daily registration as well as virtual registration. Daily registration as well as virtual. The one person who is not here who will be joining us Thursday evening at 7 o'clock p.m. for our worship experience is none other than Dr. Marcus Cosby, the senior pastor of the Wheeler Avenue Baptist Church, will be with the Conscience and Justice Council again in Huntsville, Alabama on that Thursday at 7 o'clock p.m. So definitely want you to be a part of it. Yeah, yes, there's a component with regards to use. This is an intergenerational convention. We have to be 18 or over to attend, 18 or over to attend, but really want to encourage you to register and by the 31st so you can get your complimentary T-shirt and access to the archives. We've had both Jennifer Gray Woods and Janice Warden Washington. Glad that they stayed on. I thought they might have left us, but they're still with us, Christian.
Amen.
And they can all
Amen.
speak to the convention since you're here because they have both participated. So we'll turn it over to you all. But once again, content. This is what has driven the Conscience and Justice Council's conventions that we've had. This is our 10th anniversary for doing that. So all roads lead to Huntsville. Dr. Marquise Johns will be doing the Lucille Byard Symposium, talking about classism. So we have an all-star lineup that we want to encourage you to be a part of and register and be engaged. So you can take the information here and apply it locally, not just to your church, because you remember, we're required to pastor and serve the community, not just the four walls. Anyone can feel free to comment.
Having been blessed to participate and attend, I encourage everybody to the extent you possibly can, not only register before that with that first deadline of next Thursday, so you can get that nice T-shirt. It's good quality. But if you can't by the 31st, definitely register when it's open for the daily conferences and whatnot. And if you can't physically go, look at the option of being able to join virtually. You really don't want to miss it. And with it being the 10th year of CJC doing these amazing conference conventions, there's nothing wrong with when you're missing things. There's something wrong when you miss things, but in this case, or sometimes you register for conferences and you're like, oh well, that was a bust, that was a waste. That's not the case with the conventions of CJC. You're leaving in transformed, invigorated, changed, and wanting by God's grace to share it with others and continue to be the best version of who God has called you to be. So for anyone still on, you don't want to miss it.
I second that.
Amen.
And I'll say it's very obvious that both Elder Woods and Elder Josiah, that they start planning these conventions as soon as the last one is completed, maybe even before then. You can tell by the caliber of the speakers and presenters that they have. And so, I have been blessed to attend in the past, and I'm looking forward to coming to this one as well. And I hope that many of you can come and be blessed as well.
Amen.
All
Amen.
right.
You can't get better endorsements than what we've just heard, ladies and gentlemen. These are folk who have attended. They have tasted and seen. Got a friend of mine, Dr. Snell, that talks about, you can't get excited about something unless you have tasted it, and both of you have tasted and seen. And man, we're excited to have been offered the opportunity to partner with Breath of Life. We weren't necessarily looking for it, and the Lord just impressed on Breath of Life to partner with us, man. And so we're excited to be in Huntsville, and everybody needs to get on there. I'll even give you permission, it's not sunset yet, to register right now. Amen. And so appreciate everybody staying on for a little bit longer so that we can share.
All right. And
I'm so sorry. I see a question that just popped up for some that are interested in joining the convening in September online. The question, I saw it pop up a moment ago. Do they still need to register in order to participate virtually? I don't want that question not to go unanswered.
The answer is yes. You have to register,
Yes.
and that registration will open up Monday, August 4th. Monday, August 4th. Right now, we're running an incentive because we want to know how many T-shirts we need to get and how many secure IDs we need to get as relate to those who get access to having it online. We're doing that by July 31st, and then we'll open it up Monday, August 4th, if you want to come daily for daily registration, or if you would like to register virtual registration. Virtual
Virtual.
registration is $99, just so people know. In terms of virtual registration is $99 for people to participate. I want to thank Jennifer and Janice for coming on, and then Christian and I are going to talk about the St. Louis event. So thank you once again, ladies, for your stellar sharing and expertise. Greatly appreciate it.
Yes. Thank you.
Well, Josiah, we had the event in St. Louis 2 weeks ago, and we just want to thank God for
Mhm.
$8,300 raised so far. But we're still raising money. If you go into the chat, not only can
Yep.
you see where to give, if you're doing it on Adventist Giving, just click on the local offerings at Central States Conference and click on the Conscience and Justice Council. And if you're giving in another venue, we just ask you to just put CJC in the memo line, and all those monies will be going to the tornado victims in St. Louis. For those of you who may have missed it, I put it in the YouTube channel so that you can see the event. With regards to the YouTube channel, you can go click on this event. Pastor Dr. Carlton P. Bird preached a dynamic sermon,
Uh-huh.
Community Gospel Choir of St. Louis, which was comprised of different people that formed
Mhm.
after the George Floyd incident. That was
That's right.
excellent. We had Pastor
Excellent.
Gary Thurber. That's a powerful intercessory prayer. Pastor Patty, the secretary of the Southeastern California Conference, was a
Mhm.
part of that as well. And we just had a good time of just doing a grassroots event, bringing people together to
Yes.
assist folk in need in terms of, and we just really enjoyed that and had a great time. And just want to
Yes.
remind you, where they still need funds. We're still trying to raise money. So if you can click on that link and then look at which way is the best way to give
Mhm.
money, whether it's Adventist Giving, you'll see it under local offerings for Central States Conference. You'll see Zelle,
Zell.
PayPal,
Hey,
or you can mail a check and
you
just
can
put
mail the check.
CJC.
Yes.
But we definitely want to make sure we're helping as many tornado victims as possible with
Yes.
regards to what happened in St. Louis.
Yes, yes, yes. And real quick, Dr. Woods, man, it was just good as someone who lived in St. Louis for 6.5 years, to see the church come into town. That's an old CJC phrase. And just let people know that God's truth is marching on. So we didn't want to just have a presence at the dome. We just didn't want to have a presence in restaurants and hotels and at the zoo and at the arch. But we wanted people to know that, man, we care about our city, and I appreciate your steadfastness, Doc, and your idea of us doing something in person. We've been doing virtual shows now for quite a while, but man, it was just a blessing. I know the Ministerial Alliance there, the Clergy Coalition there, a lot of our non Seventh Day Adventist friends and family really, really appreciated us making a difference. And so, yes, we've raised 8,000, right around 8,005. But we believe that we can do a lot better than that. We want to double, we want to triple that. And so, feel free to go back and watch it if you missed it, and give, and give so that we can make a difference for the many tornado victims there in St. Louis. I believe it was over 80 something percent of those in the urban core that did not have insurance. And so, man, we they need our help. They need our help. Every little bit helps. So I appreciate, again, you being able to do this, us being able to do this for our people.
We appreciate the cooperation of Central States Conference, working with Pastor Birch and Pastor V.T. Rice and the Ministerial Alliance to making sure that the money goes to the people who actually need it and have a
Absolutely.
documented need. So we like that partnership. In our ministerial manual on page 25, it really tells pastors they need to be a part of a ministerial alliance or the community-based
That's
organization.
right.
I know it might not be enforced, but that policy is clearly in the ministerial manual. And I know I was taught that
Mhm.
at Oakwood in
Right.
pastoral ministry class
That's
by
right.
Dr. Trevor Frazier. So not sure what's
Amen.
going on with the enforcement of that, but that's what we're
Well,
supposed to do.
hey, I can't speak for every conference, but the being a part of a local ministerial alliance is on our workers report as an incentive. We have some incentives that we give our pastors just to be engaged. That's one of them. Dating your spouse is another one that I kind of fall down on sometimes. But no, we got to make a difference. And as the panelists have already shared, if we're not making a difference, if we're not mingling, then what are we doing? Jesus mingled, Christ mingled. That was his method. That was his. That's how he ministered to the people, man. And so I sure appreciate you and others being willing to mingle with our people in St. Louis, man. And can't wait for Huntsville. Can't wait for Huntsville, man. Can't wait for Huntsville.
All right. God bless you and keep you. God make his face shine upon you and give you peace. We're going to leave Pastor Courtney Ray alone. We just love her from afar. But, this is an open forum. We may not agree with
Amen.
people say in the chat, but
That's
we
right.
do respect what people say. And we always have that disclaimer. But we love Pastor Courtney Ray. God bless you. Have a good night.